the 80-year-old Tom. And so
now here's a question. Do you think that there's something that has pathologized the creation of useful identities in today's culture?
Well, I think each person can judge that for themselves to some degree. I mean, the more functional your identity, the better regulated your emotion. The more positive emotion, the less negative emotion. Certainly, negative emotion doesn't rise to an intolerable level if you're fortunate your identity is well constructed. I think that any insistence that identity is something other than a pragmatic set of actions, let's say, that orient you properly in the world is sufficiently sparse so that it isn't going to solve the problems that have to be solved. So I might insist, I'm whoever I think I am at the moment, and if you were polite, you would go along with that. And to some degree, I would be right. We do that when we allow people to save face. But if I'm right, we go along with their presuppositions, presumptions. We don't call them on their mischief. And a certain amount of that's polite. But that doesn't alleviate the necessity for me of adopting a role that other people find valuable. Otherwise, what the hell do I have to trade? And you might say, well, why should I have to trade? Well, if you can live all by yourself, then you don't have to trade. But if you can't, you have to bring something of value to the table. And you can't insist on its value. Other people have to agree to that. And so I can't say, well, I'm my sexual identity. It's like, yeah, that's a part of your identity.
So this is where I wanted to go. So you brought up the idea or the example of somebody giving a sexual identity of some kind, and that was what prompted me to say, do you think there are things that are pathologizing? Is it just that people are trying to define themselves in isolation, like adopting their identity around a non-negotiated with the external people and world, a non-negotiated identity, and therefore when they try to use that as the lever by which they add value in this exchange that is life, that they're left going, what the fuck? Like, people aren't respecting it, they're not giving me what I think is my due. Is that where this begins to be a problem?
Well, I think that's certainly part of it, because it's a sparse theory of identity. It's not going to suffice, because other people have to go along with it, and they have to be able to go along with it. And you merely insisting that you're a certain way doesn't give anyone else any guidelines to go along with except for your whim, and that's going to change, and people aren't going to be able to predict it anyways. And so the thing is that in the identity politics world, there's an implicit theory of identity. Otherwise, we wouldn't have an identity politics. And obviously, the identity, it appears to be the case, that the identity that characterizes identity politics is something like unalterable characteristics. They seem somewhat arbitrarily chosen to me, which is also a huge catastrophe, because it isn't obvious why those elements of identity should be paramount. Sex, gender, race, ethnicity. There's endless numbers of other possibilities, and I can't for the life of me see why they aren't equally valued, let's say. But even if we accepted the validity of those as identity categories, the theory under that is that constitutes a sufficient, what would you describe it? That constitutes a sufficient identity. Because you see, we're not having a discussion publicly about what identity is. That's assumed a priori. It's race, it's ethnicity, it's sex, it's gender. Well, no, it's not. And that's actually a big problem. Especially when you start...
And it's not because those things are not universal. Not all transsexual people think the same, act the same. So it's unnegotiated and ultimately misleading. Is that the weakness of something like that?
That's some of the weaknesses. It's also it doesn't provide a very useful guide to action across time, because no one knows. It's a game no one knows the rules to.
Okay, so I think I'm starting to get a sense of...
That's not helpful. You know,
So,
and then wait, there's one more thing too, because there's also this analysis of culture that goes along with this. That's part of, let's say, critical race theory. You take these categories, identity categories, and you accept the implicit theory of identity upon which they're based, and then you note that the world doesn't divide up its resources equally among all those categories, and then you make the assumption that the social world is prejudiced and corrupt because of that. Well, that doesn't follow, partly because the association between those identities and reward isn't obvious. Like, you can't make a living being black. You can't make a living being white.
So now give us an example of what can you make a living? Like, are there 4 or 5, like, I was going to say, is this trying to push people to, you should have the identity of the hero or something along those lines that gives them something to strive towards, a historically charged cadre of things that they know, okay, well, if I'm the hero, I'm going to need to be brave. I'm going to have to face down the dragon of chaos. You know, there is order and structure to the way in which I need to move through the world.
Well, remember at the beginning of the conversation, I sort of provided a nested theory of identity. So for example, let's say you're a filmmaker and I'm a professor. Okay, so we differ there, right? We're playing a different game. So you might say, and as you go down into the particulars of what we do, it might even become more different. So if you look at what a plumber does and a lawyer does, as you get more and more fine-grained, they get more diverse. But you might say, well, the lawyer and the plumber are both honest. They're both good citizens. And then you might nest that inside, well, they're both acting out the archetype of the hero. And like I said, after that, you're out of things get too abstract for us to, we can't go farther than that. I think that, I think the world is order versus chaos, let's say, the balance of order and chaos it's good and evil on a background of order versus chaos. And so you're either the hero or the adversary, or actually most of the time you're a mixture of both. And it's best for you, that's what our culture has decided, it's best for you to take on the role of the hero to the degree that that's possible. And that would be associated with love. And the love, and I define that in the second book particularly, the third book I wrote, but in Beyond Order. Are you working for the betterment of being, or are you working for harm? And everyone has a sense of this, and they know when they're working for harm.
In self-authoring, do you walk people